Heart Seat for some mastermind coaching, and we already have one volunteer. And just know that we are not recording that session, and that part of the session will not be shared. The second group guideline that we have is called API. API is my favorite of all the group guidelines I've ever used over the many, many years and doing many, many meetings. It stands for Assume Positive Intent. So no matter what is said, whether it's from myself, Christina, or Lisa, or one of your peers or colleagues in the room, remember where it's coming from, it's coming from a positive place. So part of this positive place is to support and challenge each other, and always recognizing that it's coming from the best of intentions. Number 3 is adapt, not adopt, meaning especially for the content pieces that we're sharing, and also the hot seat coaching, we want you to take as much as you can, absorb as much as you can, and recognize that this isn't a game of perfection. This is a game of being strategic and using what works for you and leaving the rest behind. So adapt, not adopt. Number 4, an acknowledgement that we have things to share with you, some great tools and insights and strategies for helping all of us to get through this and lead through this crisis. But really the wisdom is in the room, and we want to acknowledge and invite you to step into this space through the chat box, take yourself off mute, raise your hand, your virtual hand. In fact, if you go down way at the bottom of your screen, you'll see where it says reflections, and you'll be able to raise your hand. And we'll do our best to monitor that, but we would love to hear from you and acknowledge the wisdom that's in the room. And lastly is the importance of stepping in, stepping up. We do have quite a bit to share with you in this first half hour, but in the mastermind section, we really want to encourage all of you to step in and step up and help with our mastermind process and the individual who is stepping into the heart seat. So those are our 5 group guidelines. I'm assuming you all agree to those, and we'll move forward with that. So we wanted to get started with just a bit of a context. And so what you're seeing up here on the screen is something we call the crisis curve. And you've probably seen it in other formats, different ways of looking at how humans experience change, whether it's positive change or negative change. We're talking about crisis, specifically going through crisis. And the important thing to recognize is that although there are 3 buckets of experiences that happen, the acute phase, the chronic phase, and the reconstruction phase, we really want to talk about, for this session, the importance of 2 pieces of the chronic phase, of the emerging reality. So we'll be talking about those in the next few minutes, and also recognizing that you may be going through this right now, or you may be having folks that are going through this, and our tendency is to hop around a little bit depending on what the day's news brings, whether it's the news on the TV or the news from our friends and family, that we can go back and forth and up and down through this curve. But those three phases seem to hold true for all of us as we're going through these different challenges.
Hey, Danny, thanks. I think I'll hop in here. For those of you who weren't on last week's call, just a quick introduction. I'm Lisa Stokes Nicholas, and I have worked with at least a couple dozen organizations, through their own organizational crises. I also specialize in nonprofit mergers, mergers often feel like a crisis to people. And I also led Planned Parenthood's hurricane response to Hurricane Katrina, and organized a clinic on the coast in which we provided direct healthcare services. And so that's sort of the background that I come to this conversation with. So I want to talk a little bit about compassion fatigue, which is one of the things that we can experience during that chronic phase, when you're sort of moving from emerging reality to what is called depression. One of the things that people really commonly experience is compassion fatigue. And it's sort of the irony of this situation that when we really seem to need it the most, we need compassion and kindness the most, often we have the least to give. I used to find this puzzling when I first started working with organizations in crisis, and couldn't quite figure out why. And it took me a while, but I started to realize the reason that people experience compassion fatigue is actually directly related to how much compassion they have for themselves. And so I just want to check in and see, is the screen stuck at this point? I'm just going to keep talking, and I'm going to assume that the screen's going to catch up with us. So like I said, it's sort of ironic, and the reason is really directly related to how much compassion we have for ourselves. And so on this next slide, we're going to sort of look at what happens during crisis that causes this fatigue. So I don't know about you all, but I and a lot of people I work with seem to carry this little critic around in our head. It's this little thing. Sometimes I don't even notice it, but it's this voice that says, oh, oh, that was good, not good enough, could have done better, so on and so forth. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. I've noticed it in myself and a lot of people. And what I noticed during crisis and what I've seen in other people is that little critic who's about this big starts to get huge during a crisis. And it's because all the things that I'm usually able to accomplish or master in a day, all of a sudden are blown away by the crisis, and I can't control them. And that makes that voice louder and louder. And as that goes on in a crisis, and I'm not able to accomplish the things I'm used to, or not used to sort of hitting the metrics, I'm not hitting the metrics I'm used to, I start to feel like I'm a failure. And that lack of compassion for myself in turn impacts then how much compassion I have for other people. I'm seeing a note that I'm pretty quiet, so I'm going to unplug my headphones and talk directly into the mic. And if this doesn't get better, somebody let me know. And so then the critical question, I think, is, how do we react or deal with compassion fatigue, right? And so just want to check in, is my volume better? Danny, can you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great.
A little.
Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. So, so how we deal with that, the end goal of this is really about creating compassion for ourselves. And there's what you see on the screen is a number of things that I've seen work for myself or other people. And Danny actually talked about one of these. He talked about connecting with his friend and bringing her food. And he talked about how he knows that she is living alone and feels isolated and lonely. And so one of the ways he generates compassion is by focusing on somebody else and really helping them. And the brain science behind this, if we just step back for a second, is that the more compassion we can generate either for ourselves or other people, the more likely our brains are to restore themselves to frontal lobe activity. During a crisis, we tend to focus on amygdala activity, where that critic does really, really well. That critic is there to keep us alive and strong. And that's where the critic lives. And the more we can generate compassion for ourselves or other people, then that restores us to frontal lobe activity, which is the activity we use to plan, to be strategic, to think ahead. And those are all skills that are really helpful, obviously, during the crisis. So a simple thing that I do, it sounds hokey. I honestly fought this for years, but I do it now on a regular basis, is to notice the critic and label it critic. And honest to God, as much as I fought it, it really helps for me to just see that critic flare up. And as a matter of fact, when I see it come up more often than usual, that's a sign to me that I'm under a lot of stress. And I'll start to look at that and say what's going on in my life, that this is happening more and more. So instead of believing the critic, I see it as a symptom and know to look deeper than that. A second thing that some people have found to be helpful and that I find to be incredibly helpful is stopping the story in my head. And when I do that, there's a couple things I do. One is totally hokey. I actually move that voice into my chest and let it melt. And for those of you who that's too woo-woo, and I can totally appreciate that, I'm not necessarily a woo-woo person myself, even just stopping that story and asking yourself questions like, well, what do we know to be factually correct? Or if this were a movie, how would this look in a movie? What would be the things that people could observe? And that that removes you or sort of transitions you from the story in your head to what's actually happening, the observable facts. Another thing is visualizing somebody you feel compassionate for. Most of us have somebody or a thing, a pet, somebody in our family, somebody in our life that we feel loving towards. Visualizing that person and flashing on that can actually help restore some of our own compassion. And then, of course, thinking about somebody who has less than you. And unfortunately, We have lots of examples right now in front of us all the time about people who are really suffering during this process and suffering more than us. No matter how much we've lost or how unstable our life is, there are people who have lost more than us, and it's really helpful to get out of our own stuff and to focus on that for a minute, and that helps restore some of that balance and restore compassion as well.
That's great, Lisa. I also love the calling out the critic or kind of imagining them. Danny shared in the chat the idea of naming your inner critic too. And I've had an exercise that was shared with me about that inner critic where imagine your inner critic is talking to you at age 5, or think of a child that you love and care for. And would you say the same things you're saying to yourself in your head to that child when you have that image in front of you? It makes it a lot harder to be quite so tough on yourself. And a lot of these places, when we're talking about moving it more external, or when we're even looking at what it is that is helping drive us to that point of compassion fatigue, often ties to unmet needs. Human beings all have needs, and we have workplace needs. We have things that we need to recognize when we're in this shared space of a team or people we're working with. And the most common ones are safety, both psychological and physical. And we know that physical is going to feel a bit more threatened right now with a pandemic on our hands, where there's a limited amount of ways we can protect our people from that. And then control. A lot of it feels like our control has been pulled away from us. And so if you may find people on your teams kind of focusing or getting really angry when the things that are normally in their control within work feel like they're removed, or feel like those needs are being unmet for them. And those may be trigger points where you see kind of erratic behavior from them, or you see people are flustered or worked up and angry about it. And then respect, that being really valued for the contributions or doing things in a kind way for each other, and recognition, being seen and heard in a conversation or in project ideas becomes extra important in that phase for people. And you may see more emotional reactions when maybe they feel unheard on a project idea, or something's moving so rapidly that they don't get the chance to participate. And that's where valued comes in. People being valued on the team is often a very, very high need in the workplace, but we also see it even more so in this moment, having triggers like anger and bringing more behavioral reactions to it. And then success or mastery, knowing how to do something. There's a lot being asked of many people right now of, this is uncharted territory. And for people who really want to have a mastery of the work that they're doing, that can be hard and really cause that discomfort in them. And balance, being able to walk away. And often that's a great need to consider, encouraging people maybe to end their day an hour earlier and do something for themselves. And so when you're kind of looking through all of these, think about what's at the root of those friction points that you might be seeing spring up on your team, or with people that your organization supports, or clients or members. Lisa, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this is true outside of a crisis for sure. These unmet needs will cause anger, but I've noticed that during a crisis, people are almost like more susceptible in this way. For example, one of my things is value, feeling valued or appreciated. And I noticed that anytime I do crisis work, the point at which I feel not valued or not appreciated is much earlier or much sooner. It's almost like I walk around with a thinner skin during crisis, and that's pretty true of most people. And that's why you start to see some irrational behavior. And the interesting thing is, when that happens for me, I actually think the messages in my head are real. And people are watching me react in a way like, and saying to themselves, what is wrong with them? And I'm guessing that several people on this call have seen that happen in the reverse, have seen people explode or behave in a way that they wouldn't normally behave. And that's what's happening for them. Their skin is thinner, and the things that are normally a little bit of a push-pull for them become a push-pull much earlier or a trigger much earlier. So thank you, Christina.
Yeah, absolutely. Danny, do you want to add anything to the need?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I'm thinking about what Lisa's talking about, not only for ourselves, but when we start to experience these unmet needs and the anger comes out or comes out in other ways, it triggers the other person's own saboteurs, if you will, their own reactions. So it becomes this, this cycle thing that is really difficult to interrupt. So the only way to interrupt it is to take stock, to be able to call out your own and understand and appreciate and mitigate your own, because odds are very good you're going to run into somebody on your team, in your family, in your world, especially during this time, that will trigger your responses. So now is the time to get a handle on them. The other thing that I was thinking was, especially with the safety and control, that those match up really well with, in fact, all of this does, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when we think about Maslow's hierarchy, how the very first level of making sure that we have food on our table or clothes on our back and a roof over our head, that can be especially important for folks right now, especially as jobs are being cut and workforces are being trimmed down. So to be conscious of that, safety comes in many different forms, including food safety, safety from the elements, those kinds of things. So to keep that in mind too, we're dealing with some pretty high level things during the crisis, and we're also dealing with a lot of basic things. So, and what could be more basic than making sure that I'm able to pay the rent and make sure my family is okay.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, Danny, and also that's a good reminder that I'd direct everyone to also check out, in the follow-up email, we'll be sharing a link to a website where we have it posted, the last session where we went more deeply into safety and control. And so that's a great thing. If that seems like the unmet need that you're seeing pop up, be sure to take a few minutes to go back and watch that content section, because that's going to help you really think about, what are those behaviors that we're seeing pop up? What can I do to help people feel more safe and in more control through each of these? And I just wanted to share, the other piece of that is also, don't be afraid to ask, what, when things are kind of simmered down a little bit from the initial reaction, saying, what piece of that felt really uncomfortable to you, or what really upset you about that? Because if they can give you a hint or name that need, it's something that you can start to proactively think about. How do I help fill this need in this time of crisis? How do I help contribute to it, or make sure that I'm being extra respectful, or I'm reminding them of how much we value them as a team member? And next week, we'll be talking about specific conflict tools that will apply to those areas. And so be sure you sign up for next week if that conversation sounds hard to you, because we'll be walking through tools that make that conversation a little bit more approachable and easier to do, even in times of crisis. So with that, I hope somebody is ready for the hot seat, because I'm going to hand it over to Danny, and he's going to lead us in our mastermind.
That's great. Thanks, Christina. Yes. And so I know Camille has stepped forward. So if we could, Camille, if you could start to get your thinking together, that would be great. And you'll be able to take yourself off mute. But before we get started, I just wanted to remind folks what we're doing here. So this is a format that we are not going to record and share, because we're going to ask you to step up and be as honest and vulnerable with us as you can, whether you're in the hot seat or not. And it's a very specific